One bullet that destroyed millions. The start of World War I. On a bright summer morning in Sarajevo, 28th of June 1914, a single pistol shot echoed through the narrow streets of the Bosnian capital. Within hours, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie lay dead. That one bullet, fired by a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip, set in motion a chain of events that would destroy empires, redraw maps, and cost more than 20 million lives. World War I did not begin because of that bullet alone, but it became the spark that ignited a world already soaked in political gasoline. Europe before the storm. To understand why one assassination could unleash such devastation, we must look at Europe in the years before 1914. The continent was a tense web of rivalries. Germany, unified only in 1871, had become a powerful industrial and military giant and challenged Britain's dominance at sea. France still burned with anger over the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. Austria-Hungary struggled to control its many ethnic groups, while Russia saw itself as protector of the Slavic peoples of the Balkans. These tensions produced two hostile alliance systems: the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. Each power built massive armies and navies, convinced that war was not only possible, but inevitable. Nationalism, militarism, and imperial competition created an atmosphere in which a local conflict could easily become continental war. The road to Sarajevo. The Balkans were known as the powder keg of Europe. Serbia, newly independent and fiercely nationalistic, dreamed of uniting all South Slavs into one state. Austria-Hungary, fearing the breakup of its empire, opposed this vision and in 1908 annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, angering Serbia and Russia alike. Secret societies such as the Black Hand formed with the goal of driving Austria out of the region. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, decided to visit Sarajevo to inspect imperial troops. The date chosen, June 28th, was deeply symbolic. It was the anniversary of Serbia's medieval defeat at Kosovo, a sacred day for Serbian nationalism. For the conspirators, the visit was an irresistible opportunity. The assassination. The plot was clumsy and almost failed. Several young conspirators lined the Archduke's route with bombs and pistols. The first attacker lost his nerve. The second threw a bomb that bounced off the car and injured bystanders instead. Believing the danger over, the royal couple continued their program. Fate intervened when the driver took a wrong turn and stopped the car directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, who was standing outside a cafe, disappointed that the plan seemed ruined. Princip stepped forward, drew his Browning pistol, and fired twice. One bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The other hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Both were dead within minutes. Princip could not have known that his act would open the gates of hell. From murder to World War Austria-Hungary, convinced that Serbia was behind the plot, sought revenge. With Germany's promise of unconditional support, the infamous blank check, Vienna issued Serbia an ultimatum designed to be impossible to accept. Serbia agreed to most demands, but not all. On 28th of July 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war. The alliance system turned a regional dispute into a global conflict with terrifying speed. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and its ally France. Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium brought Britain into the war. Within a week, all the great powers of Europe were at war. The bullet in Sarajevo had become a world conflagration, a new kind of war. Leaders on all sides believed the war would be short and glorious. Instead, it became a nightmare of trenches, machine guns, poison gas, and artillery that could kill from miles away. Battles like Verdun, the Somme, and Gallipoli consumed hundreds of thousands of lives for a few kilometers of mud. Empires that had ruled for centuries, the Russian, Ottoman, German, and Austro-Hungarian, collapsed under the strain. Civilians suffered as never before. Total war demanded the labor and loyalty of entire populations. Blockades starved cities, propaganda poisoned minds. A generation of young men disappeared. By the time the guns fell silent in November 1918, the old Europe was gone forever. The legacy of the bullet was Princip solely responsible for this catastrophe? Historians argue that war would likely have come sooner or later, given the tensions of the age. Yet without the Sarajevo assassination, the crisis of 1914 might not have exploded when it did. The bullet provided the excuse leaders needed to follow plans they had prepared for years. The Treaty of Versailles that ended the war sowed the seeds of another conflict, leading directly to World War II only 2 decades later. The Middle East, carved from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, remains unstable to this day. Modern geopolitics, international law, and even the idea of global organizations like the United Nations were shaped by the lessons of 1914. Life in the trenches. When the great powers marched to war in 1914, crowds cheered in Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and London. Soldiers were promised they would be home by Christmas. Instead, by the winter of that year, millions were trapped in a frozen line of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The war of movement had become a war of mud. Trench life was a daily battle against misery. Rats fed on the bodies of the dead, and soldiers slept in waterlogged dugouts. Diseases such as trench foot, dysentery, and influenza killed almost as many men as bullets. Between the opposing trenches lay no man's land, a wasteland of barbed wire and shell holes where thousands died trying to advance a few meters. The machine gun and modern artillery made traditional heroism almost meaningless. Survival depended more on luck than courage. Technology of destruction. World War I introduced weapons the world had never seen. Poison gas choked soldiers' lungs and blinded their eyes. Tanks crawled across battlefields like iron monsters, while airplanes evolved from fragile scouts into deadly fighters and bombers. Submarines hunted merchant ships beneath the seas, bringing the war to civilians far from the front. These inventions changed the nature of warfare forever. The Industrial Revolution, once a source of progress, now produced death on an assembly line. Factories worked day and night to supply shells, rifles, and uniforms. Entire economies were reorganized for slaughter, proving that the modern state could mobilize not just armies, but whole societies. Turning points of the war. By 1916, the conflict had become a test of endurance. At Verdun, the German army tried to bleed France white. More than 700,000 men were killed or wounded for almost no territorial gain. The Battle of the Somme, intended to relieve Verdun, became one of the bloodiest episodes in human history. 60,000 British casualties on the first day alone. Two events in 1917 changed everything. First, the United States entered the war after German submarines attacked American ships, and the Zimmermann telegram revealed German plans against the U.S. Fresh American troops and resources gave the exhausted Allies new strength. Second, the Russian Revolution overthrew the Tsar and eventually brought the Bolsheviks to power. Russia withdrew from the war, allowing Germany to concentrate on the Western Front, but it was already too late. The home front. While soldiers suffered in the trenches, civilians fought their own battles. Women replaced men in factories, offices, and farms, gaining new independence that would later fuel the fight for voting rights. Governments controlled newspapers, rationed food, and demanded total loyalty. Cities endured air raids and shortages. Families received telegrams announcing the deaths of fathers, sons, and brothers. The Spanish flu of 1918, spread partly by troop movements, killed millions more and deepened the sense that the world had gone mad. Collapse of empires. In the autumn of 1918, the Central Powers began to crumble. Bulgaria surrendered, then the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, which disintegrated into new nations. Germany, starving and facing revolution at home, asked for an armistice. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. The map of the world was transformed. Poland reappeared after more than a century. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were born. The Middle East was divided into mandates under British and French control. Old monarchies vanished, replaced by fragile democracies and angry dictatorships. A peace that failed, the victors met in Paris in 1919 to design a new order. President Woodrow Wilson dreamed of a fair peace in a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But revenge proved stronger than idealism. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany with territorial losses, military restrictions, and crushing reparations. Many Germans felt humiliated rather than reconciled. The seeds of another conflict were planted in that very treaty. Economic chaos, political extremism, and unresolved national hatreds prepared the ground for Adolf Hitler in World War II. The bullet of 1914 thus cast a shadow far longer than the 4 years of fighting. Memory and meaning. More than a century later, the First World War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, overshadowed by the even greater horrors that followed. Yet it was the true beginning of the modern age. It ended the belief in endless progress and showed how technology without humanity becomes barbarism. Gavrilo Princip, hero or terrorist? History has never agreed on how to judge the young man who fired the fatal shots. To many Serbs, Gavrilo Princip was a freedom fighter resisting foreign occupation. To Austria-Hungary and much of Europe, he was a terrorist whose fanaticism pushed the world into disaster. Princip himself was a sickly, idealistic student who believed that killing the Archduke would help create a united South Slav state. During his trial, he showed little regret, saying he had acted out of love for his people. Yet he could not have imagined the scale of suffering that would follow. Princip died of tuberculosis in prison in 1918, watching from his cell as the war he helped trigger consumed the continent. His life raises an uncomfortable question. Can a cause ever justify an act that opens the door to such horror? Emperors, kings, and presidents? The leaders of Europe also carried heavy responsibility. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany encouraged Austria-Hungary with his blank check, believing a quick war would strengthen German power. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia felt bound by honor to defend Serbia, yet his decision to mobilize turned a Balkan crisis into a continental showdown. In Britain, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and Foreign Secretary Edward Grey hesitated until Germany invaded Belgium, violating its neutrality. Grey's famous words, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime," captured the sense of doom. Across the Atlantic, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson struggled to keep America neutral, calling for peace without victory. But unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman telegram forced his hand. When American troops finally arrived, they tipped the balance, but also ensured that the United States would become a permanent world power. Moral dilemmas of total war. World War I blurred the line between soldier and civilian. Bombing of cities, naval blockades that starved children, and the use of poison gas challenged older ideas of honor. Churches, intellectuals, and artists debated whether any war could be just in an age of machine killing. Many soldiers returned home disillusioned, suffering from what was then called shell shock. Writers like Eric Maria Remarque and poets like Wilfred Owen described the war not as glorious but as meaningless slaughter. Their voices changed how later generations understood patriotism and sacrifice. Revolution and new ideologies. The chaos of the war gave birth to powerful new movements. In Russia, Lenin and the Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread, creating the world's first communist state. In Italy and Germany, anger over the peace settlement helped fascism rise. The idea that strong dictators could restore national pride attracted millions who had lost faith in democracy. Colonial subjects who fought for European empires began to demand freedom for themselves. In India, the Middle East, and Africa, veterans returned with new political awareness. The war that was meant to defend empires instead began the process of ending them. Borders drawn in blood. Diplomats in Paris tried to reorganize the world according to the principle of national self-determination, but the reality was messy. New borders in Eastern Europe placed minorities under foreign rule, creating tensions that still exist today. In the Middle East, Britain and France drew lines on maps with little regard for ethnic or religious divisions, planting the roots of future conflicts. Even the winners were scarred. Britain and France emerged exhausted and indebted. Their global dominance began to fade. The United States, relatively untouched at home, became the banker and arsenal of the world, stepping onto the stage as a superpower. Lessons for the present. The First World War teaches painful lessons about the danger of rigid alliances and unchecked nationalism. Leaders in 1914 believed they were acting rationally, yet their secret treaties and military timetables left no room for compromise. Communication failed. Pride replaced common sense. Today, the world again faces rival blocs, new weapons, and fierce national identities. The memory of 1914 warns that technology may change, but human emotions do not. Diplomacy, patience, and respect for international law are not signs of weakness. They are the thin walls that protect civilization. Soldiers from distant lands. World War I is often told as a European tragedy, yet millions who fought were not European at all. Britain and France drew heavily on their empires. Indians, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, West Africans, Algerians, and Vietnamese were carried across oceans to fight in places they had never heard of. Indian troops froze in the trenches of Flanders. Senegalese riflemen charged German positions in France. Australian and New Zealand soldiers bled on the beaches of Gallipoli. Many believed they were proving loyalty in exchange for greater rights at home. Instead, most returned to colonies that remained unequal and controlled. Their sacrifice planted early seeds of independence movements that would later dismantle the imperial world. Women in a changed society. With millions of men at the front, women stepped into roles once closed to them. They drove trams, worked in munitions factories, served as nurses near the battlefield, and managed farms and businesses. The image of the helpless Victorian woman disappeared almost overnight. This transformation had lasting consequences. After the war, several countries granted women the right to vote, acknowledging their contribution to victory. Social attitudes toward marriage, work, and education began to shift. The war, though destructive, unintentionally accelerated the march toward gender equality. Children of the war. An entire generation grew up knowing only conflict. Children collected scrap metal for the war effort, watched fathers leave in uniform, and learned to recognize the sound of air raid sirens. Many became orphans. Schools taught lessons of patriotism mixed with grief. These children of 1914 carried emotional scars into adulthood. Some became passionate pacifists determined to prevent another war. Others, hardened by loss, were drawn to radical ideologies promising strength and revenge. The political storms of the 1930s were shaped by the psychology of those who had known no secure childhood. Art born from suffering. The horror of the trenches changed culture as deeply as politics. Painters abandoned romantic scenes for broken landscapes and distorted faces. Writers rejected heroic myths. Novels like All Quiet on the Western Front and poems such as Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est exposed the lie that dying for one's country was sweet and honorable. Music, film, and memorial architecture all struggled to express grief on an industrial scale. The red poppy became a symbol of remembrance. 2 minutes of silence entered national rituals. Art became a way for society to mourn what statistics could not explain. Could it have been avoided? Historians continue to debate whether the Great War was inevitable. Some argue that Europe's rivalries made conflict certain sooner or later. Others believe wiser diplomacy in July 1914 might have contained the crisis. The tragedy is that many leaders expected a short, limited war and never imagined 4 years of global slaughter. The assassination in Sarajevo was only the match. The explosives had been piled high for decades. Understanding this does not excuse the decisions of 1914, but it shows how easily fear and pride can trap nations in paths they no longer control. Toward a fragile hope, out of the ruins emerged new ideas about cooperation. The League of Nations, humanitarian law, and early attempts at disarmament were born from the determination that such a catastrophe must never happen again. Though these efforts were imperfect, they laid foundations for later institutions like the United Nations and the Geneva Conventions. Ordinary people also built quieter forms of peace: international student exchanges, veterans' friendships across former enemy lines, and movements for reconciliation. These small acts proved that humanity was more than the hatred that had consumed it. Final conclusion: the echo of Sarajevo. The journey from a narrow street in Sarajevo to battlefields across the globe reveals a terrifying truth. History can turn on moments that seem small at the time. One bullet meant decades of suspicion, ambition, and nationalism, and the result was the first truly modern catastrophe. Remembering World War I is not only about honoring the dead, it is about guarding the future. Whenever nations speak only the language of power, whenever differences are answered with weapons instead of words, the echo of 1914 returns. Peace is never a gift handed down by history. It is a choice renewed by every generation. The millions destroyed by that single bullet ask only that the living choose more wisely.